So welcome to our Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts webinar on anti-racist SEL and positive youth development for COVID-19. My name is Corey Rulak, and I'm on the steering committee of the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts. It's great to have so many people from across the state and so many different roles, in school, out of school time, organizations, school districts, etc., all coming together for this important conversation. I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors before we get started. In particular, I'd like to thank Responsive Classrooms, a staunch supporter of SEL4MA, in general, supporting communities in Massachusetts across the United States and really around the world. We'd also like to give a special thanks to one of our newest sponsors, Edgenuity, and their Purpose Prep online SEL curriculum. We'd also like to thank Panorama Education, Lions Quest, Williams James College, Get Psych Sports, Second Step, Open Circle, Aperture Education, Get Real, Center for Supportive Schools, and Think Give. We'd also like to thank all of you who've donated or volunteered with SEL4MA over the course of the past year. Working together, we can really make a difference. SEL4MA is a grassroots organization promoting effective social and emotional learning for all communities across Massachusetts. We do that by raising awareness about what effective social and emotional learning is, its positive impacts, by advocating for policies that support effective SEL, and by supporting high quality practice by connecting people with each other and with best practices and resources. That very last part is actually what we'll be focusing on today. Moving forward, we'll have a few other workshops facilitated. For example, tomorrow, September 2nd, Corey Mccarthy will be facilitating a session titled Using Social Justice to Amplify Student Voice During COVID. Thursday, September 3rd, Kathy Lopes will be facilitating a session entitled Community Connections, Family Engagement in the Virtual World. Friday, September 4th, Stephanie Harvey will be facilitating a session entitled Restorative Approaches during COVID-19 and how to build a community with students. On Tuesday, September 8th, Rachel Plaudier will facilitate a session entitled Routines and Rituals for Connection and Consistency in the Pandemic. And finally, on Wednesday, September 9th, Camila Drummond Forrester and Randy Ross will facilitate a session entitled What is Anti-Racist SEL? So as you can see, we have a full menu of exciting offerings for you guys to take advantage of. At this time, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Bill Rayner, who will introduce the panel.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let me offer my welcome to everybody. I hope you're excited about, as I am, about the great day that we have planned. Please do not be shy about adding comments or questions in the chat room as we proceed forward. You know, in these tumultuous times that, and given the COVID and given all of the social justice issues that we're dealing with, it's important that we all share what our best practices are to be better able to help our students navigate the issues that are before them. I'm very, very excited about the experienced practitioners that we have to share their strategies about helping students and families and communities learn how to navigate the myriad of issues that are involved in creating an inclusive community. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Actually, I'd like them to introduce themselves and give an overview of who they are and what they do. And so let's start with Corey Mccarthy. Please, Corey, introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Corey Mccarthy. I'm the Director of Academics and Operations at New Mission High School. I am also an activist as well as a seeker of true justice for our youth. And I've worked very hard at these anti-racist practices for years. And I think that we're now starting to see the early start of what I'm considering to be sort of like the generational work. These problems that we have is going to take multi-generational work. So thanks for having me, and I hope you guys could get something from us today.
Thanks, Corey. Our next panelist is Kathy Lopes.
Good afternoon. I am Kathy Lopes. I saw another Lopes enter as well. So I am currently the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for the Newton Public School District. Previously, I was the Director of DEI for the METCO program, and I'm also a social worker by trade, and I saw a lot of social workers sign in today, and the majority of my social work career has been spent within education, whether high school, college, and graduate level. So I'm excited. I think similar to what Corey said, we are in a place now where we're seeing some generational excitement and really helping folks understand how to get this work done. It's a mindset, but it also is a shift in our structures and our policies and our systems. So hopefully between all of us panelists, we can give you some stuff to walk away with and start to implement.
Thank you. Next panelist is Dr. Stephanie Harvey.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. Currently, I was a previous administrator in the Boston Public School Systems. I'm currently working with UMass and running the education administration program, really just preparing teachers and for teachers who want to be principals or school leaders in general. And I think the intersection of restorative practices is where that comes into play. It's because I'm a firm believer in bringing these practices to schools as a way to mitigate conflict with students and really just to build their emotional literacy. So I really utilize that platform to get into the schools. So welcome, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Stephanie. Our next panelist is Rachel Pollner.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Bill. I have been an SEL consultant and writer of articles and books and whatnot for a while. Used to be a high school teacher, so I don't represent any particular approach to SEL at the moment, but more the K-12 kind of overarching planning, gluing it all together with a lot of experience, particularly at the secondary level, where too many schools aren't emphasizing SEL, as if all the kids are emotionally stable.
Thank you, Rachel. And let's go to our next panelist, Camila Drummond Forrester.
Bill, hi everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name's Camila Drummond Forrester. I'm a mother of 5, a daughter of immigrants, as well as the director of Open Circle, which is a social and emotional learning program that provides professional development as well as grade differentiated curriculum for children and educators in grades K through 5. I also am a facilitator with the National SEED Project. SEED stands for Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. I am interdisciplinary at my heart and soul, and therefore I do not see that SEL, equity, and anti-racism work are separate things. They are intricately intertwined, and so I hope to engage in that conversation today, learn from my fellow panelists, and those who are on the call, and hopefully this feels like a productive and positive use of your time today. So thank you.
Camila, thank you. I had a hard time hearing you. Okay. I don't know if you can do some adjustment on your volume.
All right, I'll try something now.
And our last panelist is Randy Ross.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Corey and Bill first for leading us into this conversation, and welcome to many of you. I think I'm the only person on this panel from Western Massachusetts. So those of you who are from Worcester and West, a special welcome to all of you. I've been an educator for over 45 years, and I started out in the world of Head Start, and that really set me, as well as being a 60s person and time in the civil rights movement, that formed the basis of my life's work as an educator, being focused on equity and more specifically on racial equity. I work with the area of SEL as embedded in a broader perspective of school climate. So school climate has incorporates SEL, but has a lot of other aspects to it. I've been, as I said, I've been a Head Start trainer, a middle school social studies and math teacher, an elementary principal, and for the last 20 years or so, I've worked as a trainer and coach directly with schools and with state boards of education. And before this last period of so-called retirement, which is supposedly what I'm doing now, I worked for 9 years at the New England Equity Assistance Center. And I believe I worked with some of the districts that I see represented among our attendees. So thank you all for being here, and thanks to those of you who organized this great panel.
Thank you, Randy. And not that anybody would be interested, but I started teaching in 1975, and I've taught elementary, I've taught middle school, and I've taught high school. Spent the bulk of my time in higher education at Harvard, Brown University, Holy Cross, Mass Bay Community College, and currently I'm at Framingham State University. And over that time, we've started young men of color programs and young women of color programs and 100 Middle College programs. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of my background and to let you know that that you have a great bunch of panelists here. What I would like for for the participants, if you guys could go into the chat and just in a few words, let us know in the midst of this COVID-19 and systematic racism, what are some key concerns that you have in your community around SEL and mental health? And again, don't be shy about going to the chat room. We're going to be monitoring that and hopefully addressing the different areas of concerns that you have. For our panelists, I'd like to just throw out, and anybody feel free to jump in to comment. As schools and out-of-school time organizations across Massachusetts are moving forward with plans for the fall, and given all the uncertainty, what are some strategies educators and other youth development professionals might use to support young people, to support staff, and to support families? Please, anybody feel free to begin the conversation.
Well, I'll go. You know, I think ultimately, you know, we have to look at, and I mentioned this earlier as we were talking in our group, ultimately we have to consider what is the best learning space for families as well as kids, right? And there's two separate things. And having the understanding that kids learn from their environment, and how could we, from a remote setting, influence that environment so they get the best student learning outcome, right? Or they get the best outcomes possible, as well as the family. Some of the strategies is to really, if you work in a school, you have to really push your administration to create a task force, and a task force that that operates from, let's say, a document. And this is part of my strategic plan at New Mission. We have a larger document, and that based on some of the assessments and the surveys that we got from families, we identify who's in need, who is having home issues in terms of paying rent, who's in need of a voucher, who's in need of a gift card, who has because with debt and with this current climate, there's a lot of levels of anxiety. It's on the rise. Anxiety, isolation, trauma, depression, right? So by supporting them in such a way, whether it is a gift card or a voucher through Boston Public Schools, it helps them. But from another standpoint, the task force is also assigned to visit homes if a student misses more than 2 classes a week on Zoom, right? So now you're having a home visit. Obviously, you're social distancing, but for us, it's all about evaluating what relationships matter the most to the student. So if I don't have a relationship with a student, I'm not going to their house because I don't have any leverage. However, what COVID and the pandemic has taught us is that if the kids did not respond to you when you were in school, they're not going to respond to you during remote learning. So what you have to do between now and when school starts is to work on your relationship competence. So if you work on your relationship competence, you're able to leverage sort of your relationships to really get student engagement. So part of that task force is obviously providing technology, food, resources, social, like connecting, building the connection between the social emotional learning and the social emotional and the evidence-based social emotional practices that can support the families.
Would any of the other panelists like to chime in on that?
I'd like to add to that too. I think Corey touched on some of the basic necessities we have to pay attention to, making sure resources are accessible and relationships are thoughtful. I also think that the baseline for this work, in addition to resources, is recognizing the situation that we're in, that no option right now that any school is implementing is equitable. Marginalized communities maintain their marginalization through whatever process we've chosen, whether it's hybrid or remote or working from home. So I think we just have to acknowledge that, and we have to do our best to kind of determine where are those inequities and work extra hard to make sure that we're paying attention and offering options, offering accessibility, offering connection, and really paying attention to that piece. I think the other piece too is recognizing that while we're in this pandemic, no one is emotionally stable, including ourselves. And I think it's okay to be honest about that. I think it's okay to invite students into a space that feels safe for them, that they feel seen and valued, that they feel that there's some consistency. So I think that the more consistency you can provide, the more human you can be in this moment with your students, and allow them to just show up every day and feel safe and feel connected, and then build on the pedagogy. But I want us to start making sure that they can access the space, and that the space feels as safe as possible and as equitable as possible, and then build on the logistics of what the learning can look like.
Great. Rachel, would you like to add to that?
Sure. So first I'll just echo it, right? Because we know that the relationships are so important and that they are an emotional stabilizer. When caring teachers and school counselors reach out to kids, that is an emotional stabilizer. When my 7-year-old granddaughter got every Tuesday at a certain time a phone call this past spring from her first grade teacher, she called me and her dog is fine too, is what I heard. So right, it's about the human connection, and we can frame that. We can build routines and rituals. I'm so big on those, because they keep us stable and on track and connected in normal times, right? They keep families together, they keep cultures together. There's research that NPR shares every Thanksgiving, I think, that families that have rituals, even for the people who hate the ritual, like their family better than if they didn't have the ritual. So I think if we can front load the year with relationships and with some routines and rituals to create some sense of continuity and consistency and predictability, we are in this unpredictable, uncertain, chaotic time, and the little ways that we have to mitigate that can really help.
Right. Hey, Stephanie, I'd like to ask you, how can we use trauma-informed, responsive approaches to support young people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we need to identify the trauma that has taken place through this pandemic, not just even on an individual basis, but just as a family as well. I think that a number, and disproportionately, some of our students of color or typical marginalized populations have endorsed more trauma during this time. So I think it's important for us to educate our educators on what those different elements are and what the students are and how they'll be coming into the classroom, and really just being mindful around, I think a number of people said it already, but not going so hard on the academic side in neglecting the social emotional being, right? A lot of people are coming in still in a lot of pain, still in a lot of confusion, still in an overwhelmed, anxious state. And we need to acknowledge that and provide certain breaks that are going to be possible for students. Students need to know what their outlets look like. They need to know how and when they can talk about different things. So I think it's really important for us to rethink some of the ways that we've been operating in schools and provide more cushions for folks to be able to have students express themselves.
And Camila?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I wanted to add on to what was said in the very first question around what are some of the supports. In addition to what everyone has said, I also want to emphasize the importance of the adults in the space doing this work themselves. How are we creating containers for our colleagues, for our staff members to vent, to talk about their feelings, to talk about their anxieties and what's going on to them? How are we creating spaces that are supporting their full humanity and not expecting them to walk into buildings or to be on Zoom calls as if it's business as usual? The reality is that I cannot create an environment of calm, of safety for children if I myself don't feel calm and safe. And so when we are in these caregiving and caretaking roles, sometimes there is an overemphasis on the people who we're caring for and not understanding that if the caregivers are not being cared for, they cannot do the caring that is necessary. And so I just wanted to emphasize that and underscore that with what you had asked in the beginning.
Great. And I don't think we've heard yet from Randy. So Randy, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the discussion thus far.
Sure, thanks. I want to certainly agree with the view that's been expressed that paying attention to resources and relationships is fundamental and is the ground on which we're going to be building in this extremely unusual time that we're in. One of the points that I haven't quite heard yet that I think we need to talk much more about is how, number one, how do we create situations which are mostly in schools that are on remote anyway, going to be through Zoom circles of some kind and developing staff's ability to run circles. And I think Stephanie could talk more about that, I'm sure. But using Zoom circles as a way of giving staff, parents, and students, perhaps separated and perhaps together, an opportunity to talk, and I'll say particularly to focus on the racial justice issues that are continually coming up and going to continue to come up because of the fundamental problems that we all know about. So I think the opportunity for having voice is a way of beginning to deal with some of the trauma of this period of time, because it breaks down some of the isolation. But then the next step beyond that, beyond voice, is engagement. And how can we, in each individual community, offer opportunities, particularly to middle school and high school students, but even to younger kids, to become engaged physically, masks, social distancing, maybe not in person, but in some way become engaged. Maybe it's to report and discuss cyberbullying, which would be a part of their world. There's research showing now that there's an increase in some ways in cyberbullying. That's a more complicated subject and not for today. But so those aspects, relationship and resources first, yes, but that's just the basics. And then going from voice to engagement and seeing those as ways of addressing the trauma that so many families, staff, and students are feeling.
So Corey, Randy talks about voice, and I wonder, what do you think the student voice, and how will the student voice impact what educators have planned for remote learning, or will it?
You know, when George Floyd was first murdered, you know, our community got together on Zoom. The entire school, the families, the partners, probably 400 of us was there, and you know, and helping students rationalize and understand what the power of their voices begins and ends with vocabulary, right? And understanding and really helping students understand what that vocabulary means, right? And for me, I call it sort of the glossary of like racial injustice, where I have these 70 words, 70 terms, and helping kids understand what redlining is, systemic oppression, et cetera. And then the ally talk around, how to improve these things. So building student voice. So from there, we were able to create a social justice group, and we call it the Urban Experience, Entire Urban Experience. And with that, we were able to, the students themselves, right? Because we get paid to do the great work, but the engagement came from the student voice because they felt like they were able to get somewhere. So what they did is they came up with a few terms themselves: educational reparations, right? They believed that they wanted their own kids to benefit from their work by not providing money because it could go away, by ensuring that education and what their children were being taught could live for generations, multi-generations. So they asked for financial literacy courses. They asked for a multicultural center in schools, right? Every school should have a multicultural center. White people need multicultural centers too. It's just not because we can't do this learning on our own. We know already, right? So, and they also wanted to feel from educators that they did not wake up 200, their existence as children of color did not happen when they woke up on a boat on their way from Africa. So by doing that, by fueling sort of that curiosity, we were able to really make a dent currently in Boston Public Schools. So Boston, and to give you a quick history, Boston Public Schools originally said we were going to have some in-person learning. This same group formed 3 months ago, created a video, and in the video, the kids enacted the day in the life of a student who had to return to school in a pandemic. And the amount of views that video got, it actually played a huge part in the district coming back and saying, hey, because it kind of went local viral, it played a role in the district coming back and saying, hey, we need to just hold off on this hybrid thing and let kids be, So student voice and how you do that is you have to engage their curiosity, and you can't start from hundreds of years ago. You have to meet them where they are, and you have to embrace you have to embrace and develop multicultural competence in order to engage students, right? And there's ways to do it, and we could go over those. We could strategize, but it all starts with how your core values as educators, social workers, how your core values influence or positively influence or negatively influence the teaching and learning.
Yeah, who else would like to jump in on that idea of the student voice and what impact it has on whatever planned districts might have for planned learning and remote learning, and how does the student voice impact that?
I saw Camila's hand and mine, and I'm not sure who else's, but should I jump in?
Yes, Rachel, please.
Yeah, okay. First, I'm so glad Corey brought this up, right? Because we know that in this pandemic, what was the matter before is exponentially more obvious the matter now. And one of the things that has been a problem for a long time has been taking the real world and taking the passion out of education and making it standardized and test driven. And right, so that's just another piece of what we see exaggerated in the moment, that what is engaging is actually real world, is real problem solving, is finding my own sense of agency to manage my own understandings of what's going on, my own ability to impact what's going on. And so anything that we can do that engages kids with real problems, whether they are large or small, right? Helping their classmates. There's also a project in the community. All of those help kids with engagement and with voice. To the degree that we think still in test-driven and curriculum nugget kind of structures, then it's always our territory. Kids don't know what's coming. They don't know how to be responsible for things or be autonomous or take a lead in something. The more that we use recurring formats, recurring experiences, something that happens the first time our class meets on Monday or something that happens at the end of every week, the more that kids can find their own voice and find their own leadership in those structures also. So as I think about this year as a less is more year, it's also artificial is not helpful this year, right? So this is a real year, and it's for recurring, less is more new stuff, recurring routines and rituals and formats and experiences and conversations so that kids can engage with each other and have less to have to keep track of, right? The more that we build a habit of a certain kind of task, certain way of keeping a schedule, a certain way of interacting together, the less I have to think about it when I engage in it, the more automatic it is. So we need to have more of those automatic kinds of things that become habits for students in classes and groups. And those actually build positive community and positive identity as well.
Hey, Bill, I have a question from the chat. They're concerned about how they reconnect with disenfranchised kids who felt like their needs weren't being met over this time in the pandemic.
Yeah, Kathy, why don't you tackle that?
Sure. So I think a lot of the fear that educators have around student voice or how to address things that are uncomfortable is that there's this desire to feel like you know exactly how to manage a conversation, that you have somehow gone through all of the trainings and know exactly what to say. And I think a lot of that comes from white supremacy culture, this idea that educators are supposed to be the adults and control the space. And students recognize that. So for me, it's inviting. It's inviting the stories, it's inviting the experiences that students feel like, wow, it actually matters, or I'm being asked, and when I say something, there's a response or it's being followed up on. So for students who, your assumption is that they've been disenfranchised. So one, my start is always explore. Don't make assumptions that every Black and brown student has been marginalized or disenfranchised in this, and don't make an assumption that white students also have not had this experience. So it's invite and be creative about how you invite, whether it's storytelling or games or, write a poem. And then once you have the information, really think about like what's getting in the way. And it might be like what might be helpful for you, or for you to even process, well, if this child is not able to access in this way, let me speak to a parent, let me engage with my fellow colleagues, let me ask students, what would make this more interesting? What would make this easier? Give options for students to engage. This one kind of way of delivering information and receiving information works for some, and it doesn't work for all. So I think that my recommendation is to do a lot of exploring and to be comfortable sitting in this unknown. This is unprecedented for every single one of us in education. Not only the pandemic and the fear of the pandemic, this remote learning that we're all adapting to, the racial and social unrest happening in the country. And if we're not talking about it or just acknowledging that this is a part of the air, then students aren't going to feel like they're being seen or recognized, because when they turn off the camera, that's what they're talking about with their friends or their families, or texting other folks. And it's also what you're doing on the side with your friends and your family. So I think this idea of just kind of like letting our guard down, and we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. I think just having students feel safe in that we're paying attention, that we care and we want to help is the best way to start, and not wait until you feel like you have all the answers.
Well, Camila, I see you nodding. So it seems like you have something to share on that particular topic.
Yes, I couldn't nod enough from what Rachel and Kathy and Corey were saying. When we think about student voice, when we think about how do we connect with students and families, sometimes we forget the most basic thing. Ask them. Ask them. They know sometimes what they need. They have some ideas that we may not have. And so this idea that places of teaching and learning, that there is only one direction for the education, that the adults in the classrooms, not even all the adults, right? Only the adults in the classrooms are the knowledge givers, is problematic. And so when we're in the midst of crisis, the things that are elevating to the top are the things that matter most. The reality is that every human body in that space is a knowledge giver. We all walk in this world with a set of knowledge, whether it be cultural, family, community, that is worthy and that should be honored, and that has not historically been honored, quite frankly. And so in order for us to reimagine a teaching and learning situation that is both restorative, that is trauma informed, that is healing centered, we have to honor the reciprocity of education. The fact of the matter is that I often will say that my Black children will know more about what it feels like to deal with the daily indignities and terrorism of racism than their white female teacher who most likely is in front of them. And that white female teacher should be okay with creating space for my Black children to talk about their experiences and share that. The reality is that children who are in impoverished situations are gonna have more experience and knowledge about what that feels like on a day-to-day basis to not have their basic needs met, and therefore they should be asked. And so let's get to this place of being fully human, not feeling as though we're just depositing, but there's a level of reciprocity in this teaching and learning environment that not only comes from our children and the adults in the space, but also from their families and their communities, who are their first teachers anyways.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Randy, I want to give you the final word on this particular topic.
I'm sure it's not the final word, but so there's a, I'd like to say something and throw it back to the panel, if that's okay with you, Bill. There's something I've been struggling with for a while now about SEL. This is for adults, for teachers. And I'm really following what Camila just spoke about, how white teachers need to learn to be open to the experiences of their Black and brown students and learn from them. And also, I think, learn from their parents as well, from their community. But there's an odd kind of contradiction that I think we need to explore more as leaders in this field. And that contradiction is this. On the one hand, we're saying this is a challenging period of time. Teachers are being asked to do something that they've never done before. They're needing to focus on building relationships, on finding the kids and getting connected to the kids who have not been connected before, and they need lots of support for that. And then on the other hand, we're also saying we need to challenge teachers, which can be interpreted as one more burden by those teachers. We need to challenge those educators, and this is not just teachers because it's principals and counselors and others, to be paying attention to racism and other inequities in ways that they really have not paid attention to before. So on the one hand, we're saying we need to build a more comfortable space for teachers. And on the other hand, we're saying we need to challenge in a way that may create more discomfort. So I've been struggling with that. It's not a contradiction, it's a reality. And I'm really curious as to how other people on the panel may have thought, if you have, or just what your response to that dynamic is that I've just described.
I'd like to respond to that. And if we're talking about being an anti-racist educator and creating anti-racist institutions, to consider equity is for white educators to do this work that Black and brown folks have internalized. It is to sometimes take on the burden of really unlearning what many of us have been taught. So although it seems like asking educators to do a little bit more work to engage folks, it is also recognize the burden that Black and brown students and Black and brown educators have been holding within the education system. So although it feels like more work, it's also equalizing the burden that we've been carrying, the burden that we have to sit and feel like there is no support, there is no outlet. So the investment in this work, if you're committed to being an anti-racist educator, is to find time to really think about your students differently than you may have before. And when I say just, and it's not solely white educators, because we've also been colonized in this white supremacy culture, that people of color also believe the narrative that we've been taught. So there's unlearning that happens, that needs to happen for us as well. But this work is work. For us to dismantle the hundreds of years of systems and oppression, it means that we have to engage differently, and we have to do things differently. We have to shed things differently. So it means that you're gonna just work a little bit harder, and over time, hopefully see the benefits of it. But I'm not going to kind of say that this isn't more work. And if you want to continue doing what you've been doing, then you're going to see similar results. And if you actually want to change, that it means that you have to put your foot in it.
Right. Yeah. Is Stephanie still here with us?
Yes, I'm here. And I actually would like to comment on that. Thank you for sharing that. I think that just to kind of add on to what Kathy is saying in regards to that collectiveness, is that we need to move away from just the me, and really emphasize the we. Because that's going to be really important during these times, that the students are going to need to know that it's a we, that they feel comfortable, that they feel secure, that they know that their teachers or that their support, whatever adult is in front of them, is really there for them. They're able to listen to them. They're able to be expressive. I think that that's a big piece of just shifting when we're thinking about what's going to be necessary, is around creating that empathy, and having the students kind of share out that empathy, but also just around the collective healing piece. While this pandemic has affected everybody differently, there are several commonalities, and I think it's important for us to focus on the collectiveness here, in the we, and to kind of be a little more understanding to students, and less around the individual.
Okay. And Corey, I think you have some thoughts on that.
So here's a couple of things, right? And these are it's tough to really follow Stephanie and Kathy's responses, but I'll give it a shot. So if you're going to do this work and you're searching for strategies, because you're never going to find a solution, because the solution is hundreds of years old, right? The first thing you probably should think about is sitting in your own discomfort. You have to, right? You can't just sit. You can't just, if you try to escape it, you're not going the right way. You got to find a way. If you're trying to rationalize it, you're going the wrong way. You have to sit in your discomfort, and you have to strategize your way, not to make yourself feel better, but to help yourself navigate towards building, creating a better space for your student, and for the people around you that you are trying to work with, to improve, based on the work that you're doing for yourself, right? The next thing is to listen, is to attend these things, right? You're at this webinar, and when you are at these webinars, the first thing you should do, and maybe I should have started by saying this, you have to absolutely assume that every single one of us is telling the truth. What does that mean, right? That means that there's a part of folks who are unfamiliar to the plight of Black and brown students, that actually fight whether or not we're telling the truth, right? So assume we are telling you the truth, right? Start there, right? Assume that this group is telling you the truth. Then, and your next step is to tell the students the truth. Hey, I may not have the answer, but I am white, and this is what this world has been doing to you, right? Because now you're becoming someone who is going through you're entering their journey with them, right? Their experience. And you kind of make them feel like they're going to be a part of the solution. And the final thing is for you to humanize yourself in a meaningful way that implies that you actually care. I hated my college professor so bad. I hated her so much I went to class. I didn't skip. I hated her. I wanted to go there to tell her how much I hate her. And one day she called me cousin. And she was from South Carolina. I couldn't believe she called me cousin. I was so insulted. And I said, why did you call me cousin, white woman? And she said, because I'm from South Carolina and people from your country used to go to South Carolina and come from Barbados to South Carolina. They found jobs, they settled, and they're saying that 1/3 of the people from South Carolina is from Barbados. I went to the class the next day and I was so happy. I brought my notebook. I was up whistling, ironing my clothes because she took her time with me and she didn't lose patience. So I think that what we all have to do is many out of the box practices that involve leveraging empathy and looking at it a lot differently.
Can I add on here?
Please do.
One of the things that I want to share, and I agree with my colleagues with everything that they've been saying, is racism is a white issue. I don't have an issue with my color. And so sometimes we do not focus on the detriment of the system of racism to white people. Similarly, how we do not focus on the detriment of patriarchy to men and boys. It dehumanizes you. And so dismantling these systems of oppression are not just beneficial to those who are the targets of the oppression. Understand, the perpetrators of these oppressions also need assistance and help and will benefit from it vastly. Secondly, there is a racial illiteracy with white folks that we have to contend with in this country. And this is what I was mentioning when I talked about my Black children being more literate, quite frankly, as it relates to racism in this country. And so just like with any other types of illiteracy, as educators, as district leaders, as superintendents, we have very clear methodology of how to eradicate that illiteracy, how to diminish it, how to help folks become literate. You cannot expect to become literate in race relations, in race, if you're not having intentional, thoughtful conversations and reflections about how your race has impacted how you view the world, how your race impacts your curricula, how your race, how you didn't realize, how you didn't think about race until you got to college and had a bunch of, professors who were not white. And so these are questions and reflections that we need to engage in collectively as educators and district leaders, and do that in the adult space. Like, you cannot, we can cause harm if we are not coming from a space of first learning for ourselves. I cannot walk into a school and say I'm going to be a math teacher just because I budget my own budget from my household. I can do math, but guess what? I got to prove that I not only practice math, but I also then went to school to learn how to teach math and then demonstrated some level of proficiency on how to teach it and how to do it. And so why do we think we can cut corners when it comes to systems of oppression and racism? We have to engage in that same level of work. We have to be committed to that same process. And so therefore it's a process. And the last thing I will say is, lean into your full humanity. When I talk to my staff members, which is primarily white, this is the staff members that I inherited at Open Circle, and we do hard work. What I say to them is this: when you are a white person walking into diverse settings, I am going to know and feel your genuineness only if you are speaking from a place of the work you're doing as a white person. You need to come into that space with a level of cultural humility. If you're not familiar with that term, I suggest folks Google it and look it up. I really love the framework, and I think it's an important one for us to elevate and talk more about as we talk about this, dismantling these systems, cultural humility, but also just talk from your place of doing your own work as a white person. And it doesn't mean you have to have all the answers, as Kathy has mentioned. It doesn't mean that you're always going to say the right things. But again, it's about leaning into our full humanity, giving each other grace in the same way that we expect you to give grace to the children. There are going to be days where kids are getting up and they're not going to be focused on Zoom. That shouldn't be a demerit. That shouldn't be, now you get points off today because you didn't show up. Aren't there days when you don't feel your full best? Aren't there days when your best is a C level, or your best, and then other days where your best is an A level? So integrating grace, integrating racial literacy, and integrating full humanity is going to be critical for us to form the level of authenticity, anti-racist work that we need to do in these schools. And let's be clear, we're recreating this and reimagining this collectively. This was never a part of the design. So we don't even know what that looks like. We're imagining this. And so I think that needs to be important. So we don't even have a template here in America for this. The template has always been to create these systems that creates what we're seeing now, these opportunities gap, these academic gaps, because that's what the system was built for. So we're doing this co-creation and this co-imagining together. And it's time to listen to Black and brown folks who have been doing this work and embedding this work for a long time.
Thank you. Rachel, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, has COVID-19 made racism more visible? And in which ways? And to whom?
I would imagine it's made it incredibly more visible in all sorts of different ways to everyone, hasn't it? I think I'm certainly hearing from all of the schools I work with. But I also want to pick up on something that Camila was saying about doing our own work. And so, right, we all wear different hats in our lives. And in my community organizing hat, I am hearing more people leaning into these big questions than I've ever heard before, forming their own small book groups, forming their own self-inquiry processes. And I think that there is an uncovering that happened with COVID and that happened with the racial reckoning that should have been. There's no excuse not to be aware of it prior, but for some people, there is a new unveiling. And I'm not, or in a sense, I'm going all the way back to Randy's question about the leaning into the discomfort. I'm finding much more willingness to go there than I've ever seen. And so I think it's incumbent on us to take advantage of that and to make the connection. It's incredibly difficult that we're facing these double traumas, but in a sense, I guess they somehow came together because the pandemic laid everything bare, and then what happened to George Floyd and all the events since showed us what was underneath all of that veil. And so I'm finding people more willing to lean in. And I think that we have to figure out if there's anything that's going to come out of this year, what will it be? And I think that is part of it, is having the groups where we can really lean in, where we can really learn together, listen to each other. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephanie, I'd like to hear from you on this.
I mean, I think that a number of people have really summarized this, and I agree it is hard to follow with such experts on this call. I do agree that folks are leaning more into the conversation, and I appreciate that somebody had said earlier in regards to that folks don't have to have all the answers. And I think we need to continue to reemphasize that, because a lot of us do not have the answers, and we need to understand that we're going to create the answers together. And I think that as much as we're able to kind of push on our colleagues, I know there's a ton of different work out there that's saying we don't need any more allies, specifically Bettina Love's work in regards to not saying we need co-conspirators opposed to allies, right? We really need folks who are going to go in there and disrupt some of the conversations that are taking place, or disrupt some of the practices that are taking place. So I think it's really important to think beyond what we've been doing, and welcome folks with the understanding that it's okay to make a mistake as we're in this critical period.
Yeah, Randy, are you there with us?
I'm here. So I asked the question, and I think we got a lot of we went in a few different directions. So I'm going to play teacher here and summarize what I think were some of the responses to the question that I asked initially. I think the main thing that I'm hearing, and that I asked the question because I obviously believe strongly that this is a time for challenge. Rachel said that she felt that there was, she was seeing a more willingness to address, or to at least among white educators, I think she really meant white educators, more willingness to take on and look more deeply into racial injustice in schools, and not necessarily to sit with the, oh my God, I can't take one more thing kind of an attitude. So it's almost like, well, the ground has been turned up, let's finally deal with this. My concern, and I know there's lots of other questions, but my concern is, how do we move to action as educators, and in the multiple ways that are needed to address racism and all kinds of inequities? How do we move from the conversation to actually changing policy? Because I'm a Kendi fan. It's really about educational policy. And because so much is changing right now, in a way, it's a good time to challenge policy. I liked something, who was it? I think it was Corey who said something about a student group that made a video and that actually impacted policy. Was that you, Corey? That actually impacted policy in the district. And Kathy also mentioned policy. So that's a thought that's going on in my head as I'm listening to all of my colleagues, and also watching some of what's going on in the chat, which I have open on the side of my screen as well. It is certainly about individual development. It's certainly around, individual self-reflection and self-development. It's around working with colleagues and with parents and with students. And then how do we get the policy change that sustains the move toward greater racial and educational equity in general?
I saw something. Go on, Kathy, please.
So I want to respond to what Randy said, and also acknowledge some of the conversation that's going on in the chat, because I think this is sometimes where we get stuck. Because there are policies and rules and regulations that we have been kind of trained to abide by. And I want to go back to my sentiment of exploring and assessing as to why a student may not be engaging, why a parent may not be as responsive as some of the other parents, and not to make assumptions that people are lazy, or they're trying to game a system, or that they've now heard that they can get on without having to put in the work, right? School, for all of us, is a place not only to become educated, and as educators, that's our main priority, but it's a place to socialize. So if you're creating a space where children want to show up because they feel connected, they enjoy the learning because there's some context, there's some cultural context to the learning, that they get to engage with other friends and developmentally build, then you're going to get more engagement. But I think I would want to start with just trying to identify, what is it? Maybe the student doesn't like me. Maybe this class is really difficult and the student doesn't feel good about themselves in the way that I asked them to provide information, might be shameful or might be harmful to their own ego. Maybe their parents are essential workers and cannot support their student, so therefore the student can't have access, right? But to make assumptions that people are choosing to not participate just off the fact that they think that there's a way around the system, I think is we need to dismantle that thinking. As a society, we make those assumptions about people who are on unemployment, or people who are immigrating here, and that's the work, right? We've been learned to believe you just should, and when you don't, that we have to create some accountability. And that's the structure that we need to dismantle. So when we think about policies, we have to look at policies that penalize people based off of just kind of impartial information, right? Our discipline policies, our hiring policies, that we determine what credentials are necessary for certain jobs, when credentialing doesn't necessarily equate to someone doing their job well, right? So how do we deconstruct? How do we find the right educators or the right people to fill the right positions? How do we look at our grading policies that feel more equitable, that don't only benefit those who are already embedded in the system? So you have to think about these policies, you have to get involved, you have to be at the table, we have to have leaders of a diverse representation at the table that can talk to this and be key decision makers from the administrative level, the superintendent level, the department head level, and for teachers and families getting involved. So policy shift provide needs a community approach, that everyone is really understanding how harmful this policy may be and how this policy may be more beneficial and equitable, that all students are engaging. So there's school policy out there, there's school committees, there's HR. So become involved if this is a passion of you. Build a coalition with your unions and with your partners to say, we're really struggling with this particular policy around testing, or we're really struggling with this policy around PDs and getting credits for this, because it really only benefits this group. So you have to be willing to do the research and then step in with a coalition and provide an alternative.
Yes, Rachel.
So I'm agreeing with everything Kathy was just saying, and I want to build on it, because if I remember correctly, when I was scanning through who was attending today and their various roles, there's a lot of people who might not feel like they can have a say in policy. So in groups, you more likely can, so that's part of it. But where those policies come to life every day is in practices, and we all can have a lot of control over our practices. And I'm finding, I was conscious, there's a lot of interesting comments in the chat box, and brains don't actually listen carefully to a conversation and read carefully in a chat box at the same time. In the workshops I've been doing lately, I've been saying explicitly to people, we're going to take a minute because I need to catch up, and I bet you do, and then we'll have a richer conversation, because we all need to see what's in the chat box and what we're thinking, and then we can respond more effectively. And I've been saying explicitly, it feels really awkward on Zoom to have a minute of silence, and yet we're going to lean in and we're going to do it. And that's been, it's been a bit of a anxiety reducer, and it's like a self-forgiveness moment. We don't actually double task. There are people who think they do. That is not actually how brains work. And so to own that and give people time for that, or another little practice, in case anybody was listening to an interview on NPR of Mr. Khan from Khan Academy, who was talking about online learning and saying students can be more passive online. And so you should do things like cold calling. And let me tell you, cold calling was bad before, and it's worse now, right? If we ever thought that that cold calling a child, it's normal for minds to wander. That is normal. It is not normal to be attentive and vigilant every single minute and ready to respond to a question coming your way, so that when someone says to you, Rachel, answer the question I just asked, that might have been my wandering moment, which is not fair to interrupt. The teacher could have said to me, Rachel, Robbie, Sasha, I'm calling on you 3 minutes from now. Now I can be engaged and it's not humiliating. So I think part of what we are, the stuff that we have, this is one of those years, right? We keep saying less is more, figure out what you have control over, do that better. And the veil is off of everything. This is one of those years where anything that was anxiety provoking before is worse now. Switch it. And to be really thoughtful about the various practices that we have. What brings people together? What creates more patience? What creates less anxiety? My suburban districts, I think, are all on suicide watch this year because the anxiety levels and the isolation are so big. There are different, so that's all to say this is a really difficult year. I feel like I'm preaching a lot of self-forgiveness, patience, get to know what the brain does and doesn't do. It doesn't do multitasking. Let's build that in. It doesn't do catch me in this moment and I won't feel humiliated. No, that is not actually how we operate. And so to be really astute about our own need for social acceptance, our own need for think time, all of those different practices, that's how I think we bring some of the policy into our daily practices and represent it all day, every day. I'm going to have one other little comment. I've just occurred to me. I was going to stop. But there was a comment about teaching SEL lessons, right? Which is hard anyway and really hard in a pandemic. And it's our modeling of SEL principles that matters even more than the actual teaching of an SEL lesson.
Yeah, hey, this is actually for Jim and Corey. I don't know if everybody has access to the transcript of the chat room, because there are some really beautiful and valuable resources that people are sharing. Are people going to be able to access that at some other point? Because it's very hard to decipher it and discern it at this particular point in time.
We will try to make those resources available to participants. Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be great if they could follow up on that. We don't have a bunch of time left, but one of the things, and I think Corey mentioned it, and I just wanted to get people's thoughts on it. When you hear the idea of educational reparations, what does that spark in you when someone talks about educational reparations, and how would that look? Camila, why don't you give us your thoughts on that?
This is going to be just a shot in the dark. So this is just my own thinking around this. Educational reparations, the word reparations is to repair. And so it would need to require us to think about the harm that has been done within the educational system to many historically marginalized groups, and find ways of bringing them in to a moment of discussion to figure out how we can make amends for that harm that has been done over generations, and find new ways of elevating, honoring, and affirming their voice, their knowledge set that that can contribute to the educational setting. I think it requires us to not say things like, well, we put out a job listing and we just couldn't find any Black or brown educators or administrators. I think it requires us to get a bit more creative, to get a bit more intentional about creating pipelines for a more diverse teaching staff, not only teaching, but also superintendents, principals, because the reality is that I have seen many teachers who are doing many of the things that we're talking about within their classrooms. But once they step out of their classrooms, they don't have the supports that they need. And so we need to diversify not only as it pertains to race, but also as it pertains to experience, as it pertains to our approach, right? This meritocracy approach that I've actually seen in the chat being discussed is firmly embedded in harm structures of oppression. And so, again, when I think about the word reparations, no matter what the adjective is before that word, for me, I think about repairing harm. And so we first have to go back to analyze and uncover what the harm has been, and then finding ways from there to repair that.
I'll say this really quick, right? Kathy, I'm sorry I cut you off. And I based on what Camila just said, let's be clear, right? This country still has a problem with the word free when it comes to Black and brown people. They have a problem with free education. They see things, they have a problem with free opportunity. They have a problem with free food. They have a problem with free access. So everything, if everything that hurts black or brown people, you could go back to the ideology of freedom, right? The things that are continue to hurt our children is directly related to freedom and access, right? And for anyone to really try to call themselves to get involved, even the comment about kids moving along, and I'm not attacking anyone. What I'm saying is that, is it the problem with the kids moving along, or the problem with the kids getting off free, right? So as we move on, and as we learn together, because that's what we're trying to do, I think the smart thing for us to do, all of us to do, is this. Everything you do, let me go back a little bit. If we see a young white boy getting shot by a cop in his back 7 times, there's going to be a lot more outrage. If there's a kidnapping of a young white girl, Amber Alert, national outrage, right? That's because we are conditioned to do everything with white privileges in mind. However, if we want to do this work together, we must do everything as educators, never mind the larger world, we must do everything with black children and black and brown children in mind. I don't even care if it's what you eat. If you're late for Dunkin' Donuts, if you're late to teach those black and brown kids, and because you want to stop at Dunkin' Donuts, and they see that they're engaged in this routine of your practice of being late because you don't think their education matters as much, you are participating in the very things that we are on this panel trying to defeat. Sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
No, and I also want to add just the word reparations. And so for reparations to occur, and we need to, as a country, actually own the harm that we've done. And we're not there yet. If we think about Germany and the Holocaust or South African apartheid, they have as a country has acknowledged what we've done is wrong, and they honor the victims. Here in this country, we are still having conversations when Black Lives Matter is said, we still hear Blue Lives Matter, right? We are still, when someone says white privilege, says, I struggled. So there's still an argument. We're still not at the same level of just understanding what happened in this country 400 years ago was unequivocally not okay. And the ramification of that still exists today, because sometimes the argument is, well, it's happened, let's move on. So we really need to understand the ways that this system has been fluid in disenfranchising folks who look like me. And until we get to a place where this country is willing to say, we get it, it was wrong, it's still an issue across the board, then reparations really won't come to fruition. But as an educator, one of the ways that we can unlearn or change some of this is to really look at curriculum and the narratives and break down the narratives that we continue to teach, the narratives that we were taught about Christopher Columbus and Thanksgiving, the narratives that we've been taught about, slavery, and there were good slaves and they were treated well, and really understand the harm that was done to folks of color, indigenous folks, and folks that were brought here on ships, and how that still plays out for the indigenous community and their lack of land, and for Black and brown folks and their lack of access to housing and equitable education and resources. That still plays on as we see now in college, or we see, in networking and job attainment. But I think that as educators, looking at what am I teaching? Am I still teaching this story that is about slavery, which just victimizes Black folks? And then we jump to, well, Martin Luther King was a good guy. And we skip over Malcolm X, we skip over the Black Panther Party, we skip over women in the revolution, we skip over white allies, we skip over the way the FBI and the government actually perpetuated this, right? I share often when I do these workshops, the Holocaust, the way that we're taught about the Holocaust is through the diary diary of Anne Frank, through the eyes of a child. So we internalize the human experience for a child, the fear, her family, the trauma. So we are embedded in how awful the Holocaust was to the human, to the family structure, to the culture. And we don't do that with slavery. We say this happened, Abraham Lincoln freed everyone, and Martin Luther King did this peacefully. And that really doesn't do justice to the ongoing harm that is still happening. So if you are in a position to dismantle that narrative in your classroom, and you can do that through math and science and talk about, you know, all the brilliant folks that have contributed. It's not necessarily just for history or English, but there are ways to incorporate this history in a more accurate version that celebrates the beauty of difference, but also acknowledges that there was harm, it was intentional, it was violent, and it is sustained today. We have a president of the United States right now who is saying that the person, the 17-year-old that murdered folks, may have had a reason, and we do not give grace. He was at 17, has been placed in juvenile detention for the murder and harm of 3 people. He murdered 2 people and harmed another, while Khalif Bauer was sent to Rikers Island at the age of 16 for allegedly stealing a backpack. And that is not the grace we give Black and brown folks in this country. So reparations is when we look at everyone as human and it's equitable. And then we have to find out, what are we doing to contribute to this? And how do I give maybe a little bit more to this marginalized group than I do to the already successful resource group? And it might look unequal, but if we're really thinking about, I'm just trying to level it out, that's the reparations. And there are ways you can do that in your classroom, through your curriculum, and also through your relationships and grace.
What a powerful way to end this webinar. I'm excited about the robust discussion and the robust questions that participants have offered. I want to remind you that we're going to have a series of workshops following this one, where these panelists will be facilitating workshops on these very topics. Because we have about 15 minutes left, I'd like to give Bill the opportunity to have our panelists wrap up before we say goodbye. So Bill?
Yes, well, after listening to our panelists, I think all of you can agree that they are very knowledgeable about their subject, and each of them are going to be undertaking and giving workshops, which I hope you make yourselves, avail yourselves of in the coming weeks. So in wrapping up, let's go out in the order that we came in. Let's hear from Corey and some final thoughts.
Well, when you do this work, you have to constantly and you have to really and truly constantly evaluate why you're doing the work, because this work is not for someone who wants to make themselves feel better, and it's not a function or a byproduct of some guilt. This work must be done with the understanding that there's a goal of equality and really buying in to what the natural human being is, not the white person, not the, if race, like if, you know, I was saying the other day, if race wasn't a problem, we wouldn't have races, right? So now we have to identify how to support kids along this journey, whether it's amplifying their voices or modeling behaviors for students or modeling behaviors in your personal lives with students in mind, with Black and brown students in mind. And then looking at how are you teaching our students, right? So one, are you teaching gratefulness? Are we teaching resilience? And I think that's the next level of thinking, that we have to have a higher order of thinking now. We know where the damage is being done.
Thanks, Corey. When is your workshop?
I believe I'm 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Beautiful. Kathy.
Yes. So I want to begin by just acknowledging that there are 127 people in this room who decided to show up today because this matters. And so, we see you, and I recognize that as change and recognizes you wanting to do the work. I want to just, and sometimes these conversations are challenging, and that is part of the work, but the fact that you've showed up and you've engaged, kudos to you, and continue moving forward. I think that the panelists have given kind of a general conceptual idea of how to think about this. And hopefully as you move on to the trainings, you'll learn a little bit more skill and strategy. I know as educators, that's always a desire. What does this actually look like? So hopefully we'll be able to help you think about that a little bit more in your classroom. But I think the conversation today is to really get us centered in, how do we value every student that's coming into our classroom as humans and as all of us going through this experience together. And every day we're getting information thrown at us that is painful, that is harmful, that is confusing, that is conflicting. And how do we hold space for ourselves, and how do we hold space for our babies and the children that we care about, that they can actually just feel centered and then engage them in the learning. So that's what I hope that you've been able to take away from this conversation.
Great. And Kathy, your workshop is?
I believe it's Thursday at 9 o'clock. So I'll be talking about how to engage families through the virtual world from an SEL frame.
Terrific. And Stephanie?
Absolutely. Thank you. Again, just to echo Kathy, I do appreciate everyone's participation in coming to this. It does speak to your commitment. I also just I'll plug my workshop as well as on Friday at 9 o'clock, and it's around restorative approaches. And I think what a lot of folks, and I think it's a good time to kind of pause and remember, I think a lot of folks think of restorative practices or restorative approaches as something different. And it's really important for us to just sit back and realize that it's not anything we need to do different. It's really just a philosophy on how we interact with folks. And I think now more than ever, it's an opportunity for us to reform that and to think through that collectively about what that means. So I encourage folks to come, and thank you for your time today.
Beautiful. Rachel. You're muted, Rachel. Unmute yourself.
I think I just did I? Yeah.
There you go.
So my session's on Tuesday morning. I think they're all at 9, and it's on rituals and routines, things that we can control in the moment. I think we need to grapple with the big picture and find the things we can change immediately in order to sustain our own sense of agency and make things better for students. And I am just picking up on one thing that Corey mentioned, the word resilience, which I'm going to emphasize quite a bit about on Tuesday, because this is a hard year, and we are all going to need to be resilient. But resilience in the real research has never only been about internal capacities. It has always been about the community around us, the obstacles placed or not placed in our way. It's always been about the bigger structures. We can't actually help people be resilient unless we're talking about the internal skills and the external world. And so that's a little teaser for Tuesday.
Beautiful. Camila.
Just wanted to echo what everyone else has been saying. Thank you all for being here today. What a wonderful turnout, 122 people. That is great. I am co-facilitating a session with Randy on the 9th, and it is entitled, What is Anti-Racist SEL? I will end with saying, you can't teach what you don't know, and you teach who you are. And so the work begins with self. The work begins with the adult community. We can't expect to create an anti-racist, an equitable, a caring community for children if the adults in that community are not feeling seen, heard, or cared for. And so I hope that some of the things that have been said today have either affirmed you or have felt like new sparks of light that you can continue to think through. And I would encourage everyone to join all of the sessions because we will be able to get deeper into actual strategies and techniques that support some of these general ideas that we've discussed today.
And Randy? Randy, unmute yourself.
I am. Okay. I think, as everyone else has said, thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists for such a really in-depth conversation. Someone in the chat made a comment about appreciating the fact that this was not a sugar-coated conversation, and also appreciate how diverse the faces are here on this Zoom. And so thank you for that comment. I'll just, Camila already talked a little bit about the workshop we're going to be doing together, and I'm going to highlight one point that we'll be discussing, and this ties into the resilience theme that we've been talking about. And so I'm going to, or we're going to be talking about how advocacy is learning how to be an advocate for oneself and for one's people and for justice in general is an SEL skill. It's a way of reframing some of the ways we've talked about SEL in the past. So how do we become advocates, and how is that tied to breaking down isolation, particularly in this COVID period, and how is it therefore tied to resilience and dealing with trauma? So I think we're going to pull together, we happen to be the last workshop of this series, and so I'm hoping that we'll also be able to pull together some of the themes, but particularly through the lens of anti-racism.
Excellent. I just want to thank Jim and Corey for allowing me to be such a small part of today's discussion, and hopefully all of you will attend the various sessions that are being offered. I think you've got a taste of the knowledge and abilities of the panelists, and they can get more in depth into the nitty-gritty of change. So thanks, Corey.
Excellent. And in closing, I'd like to thank Bill and the panel and panelists for showing up. I think the number got up to 137 or 140 or so. But I'd like to remind you that this workshop was recorded, and you can share it with your friends and keep it to refer back to. If you'd like to go deeper with any of the topics that we talked about today, remind you that there are a series of events that we'll be having throughout this and next week from around 9 to 11 each day. Tomorrow, September 2nd, Corey Mccarthy will be facilitating a session. Thursday, September 3rd, Kathy Lopes will be facilitating a session. Friday, September 4th, Stephanie Harvey will be facilitating a session. September the 8th, on Tuesday, Rachel will be facilitating a session, and Wednesday, September 9th, Camila and Randy will co-facilitate a session. Thanks again to our moderator and our panelists, to our sponsors and donors, volunteers, and all of you for the important work you do every day. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.